ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to LifeTalk, a celebration of the power of sharing ideas that our host Roche is launching in connection with its 125th birthday. I'm Melinda Crane, and it's a great honor to accompany you today as moderator. And I'd like to say how very nice it is that we can meet partly in person. A very warm welcome to all of those who are here with us in the room, and also to our online audience. Great that you're joining us regardless from what time zone you're in. We're so glad you could be with us. Innovation is not necessarily the first trait that you would associate with the venerable age that Roche has now reached. Yet, that is our topic this evening, and in fact, it is absolutely fitting for this company and for this particular moment in time. First, the company. Fritz Hoffmann upended his family's business of ribbon manufacturing after he had experienced the devastating cholera epidemic in Hamburg and also seen Robert Koch's efforts to contain that epidemic. Convinced that the industrial manufacture and international distribution of standardized medicines could save countless lives, he founded Roche. Now, fast forward from that epidemic-driven startup to our moment in time, 125 years later. The pandemic has disrupted our lives. It has decimated livelihoods. It has closed schools, crippled economies, snarled trade. And at the same time, it has prompted absolutely groundbreaking innovation at breathtaking speed in testing and diagnostics, in the development and distribution of safe and effective vaccines, in digitalization within as well as well beyond the health sector, in the way that we work, and in what our film called the sharing of ideas amongst academics, the sharing of ideas between scientists, industry, and government. And sharing ideas is exactly what we want to do here this evening. A modern renaissance. Is the crisis leading to innovation? And can we sustain and build on the gains? That's our topic. We have a fascinating three-pronged program to address it. We begin with a keynote from a renowned health thought leader and strategist, continue with a panel that brings together leaders from industry, pandemic management, ethics, and patient advocacy, and finish with a fishbowl that gives us an opportunity to take an inside view on innovation and collaboration amongst the hands-on experts here at Roche. So that's what's in store. And ladies and gentlemen, before we begin, let me just say that we are very, very eager to hear from you. We welcome your input, both in the form of questions and short comments, and also your answers to a few polls that we want to pose to you to gather the wisdom of the crowd, as it were. You can weigh in on our polls if you're here in the room with us by using your smartphone to please scan the barcode that you found on your seats. That will take you to our tool, our poll app, or our tool, which will allow you to take part in the polls. And if you are joining us online, you will see both a Q&A tab on the YouTube live stream, and also there as well polls, which you can then also vote on. So let us do just a very quick test, please, to make sure that everybody's got the technology up and working, because we don't want to miss your input. And here's a first question that we would like to pose to you. How have you personally been affected by the pandemic? And we have a few different answers in our multiple choice selection here. First one, I had COVID. Second, interruption of treatment for a pre-existing illness due to health system overload. Third one, a family member or friend was seriously ill or died. And fourth one, economic hardship, either personally or in your core family. So weigh in on that, if you would, please. And we're going to give you just a little bit of time to do that, because I know that everybody first has to get the technology working. And as I say, we are very eager to know, how has the pandemic affected you personally? What has it meant in your life? So here in the room, on our polling tool, we have 51% who say they had a family member or a friend who was seriously ill or died. 21% of those here in the room had COVID. This is a fairly young audience. That's interesting. Economic hardship, personally or in the core family, that's 24%. And I'm gathering that 4% possibly had interrupted treatment. Yeah, 4% had interruption of treatment. So that is the result here for the room. And I'm hoping that in a few moments, we may also get a take on what our online audience has had to say. Let's just give that another minute or two, and otherwise we will go back to it a bit later on. So YouTube, 41% had a family member or a friend who was seriously ill or died. And we will come back a little bit later to those online results, but clearly a major, major impact. And of course, our sympathies go out to all who have suffered losses in their families, and of course, also the other effects that we have seen here in the poll. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. Now, it is a pleasure to welcome the CEO of Transform Health. He was the first Dutch Health 2.0 ambassador. He founded Reshape, a program of Radboud University Nijmegen Medical Center that's dedicated to fostering the self-empowered patient. He has also served as faculty member at the Singularity University in Silicon Valley and as global strategist digital health at the Deloitte Center for the Edge. Lucien Engelen, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Melinda, for that kind introduction. And let me first start, Severin, for you and all for your colleagues, of course. Congratulations with your 125th anniversary. I think it's been profound, the global impact that you had, not only with pharma, but also with diagnostics in the world and the innovation that made these things happen in the end of the day. And think about all the things that you have achieved in those 125 years, and think about then what will happen in the next 25 years with all the technology really increasing. Because I think that really is the case at present. We really are now at what I like to call crossroads. A crossroad where we have to make a choice. In the end of the day, we've seen, and we came to a new era where we need to think about whether we should treat in healthcare digital first and physical next, because that's the thing that we really see at this very moment. The world is changing at rapid pace. Everything that we see is changing by the minute, so to say. And the ongoing pandemic unleashed an enormous amount of innovation at one end, and currently this also leads to many questions whether or not we really should take that alley. To concentrate at one moment in time on the interface between patients, families and informal care at one end, and healthcare professionals at the other. And we know that digitization in the end of the day can prove many, many things and also can create better healthcare in the end of the day. But we also should be honest. We also can see that it could create a new divide and also could make us an outsider if we don't use all the technology that's out there already. When I say adapt it from society, because that's what I think that we need to do, to adapt what's happening in society also to healthcare. I don't mean only that who is working there as in terms of diversity, but also how we work. let's be honest, we see the interface not in healthcare changing also by the minute. And it's not only the user interface, the way that we offer healthcare, but also the user experience in how people will perceive healthcare. How different is that in the rest of society, where we make payments digitally, completely, of course, where we order our groceries digitally, where we even have our travel documents digitally on our smartphone. We have become a digital society. And that's where I think healthcare is losing society a bit. Of course, we've used digital technology, and we had to, in a lot of cases, of course. We started to use this simply because we had no other possibility to reach our patients, to bring patients in digitally, and also patients were scared to come to our facilities. But apart from the fact that we now also observe that is increasingly rolled back during this pandemic still, we also see that it was no intrinsic motivation of healthcare to do so. And again, I think that that is also where healthcare is losing society a bit. I've said in a national newspaper that we've been pregnant for digital health for years, and all of a sudden this came to life through a C-section, because we had to. And the world around us is changing fast. But healthcare is not changing fast enough, and we really need to up our game in terms of the user interface and the user experience. Patients and their loved ones expect us to do so. Because again, in healthcare, they're using these tools on a daily basis. In 2021, the level, the breadth, and the impact of that portion of digital and healthcare is almost marginalizable. We are losing society again here a bit. And let's run through the store like a blind horse then? Of course not. I really think that we must take care also about our employees and also about our patients and citizens. Let's not create that new divide. We have to take care of that. And that's also why I think we should talk about a Copernican moment. It should really not be either or, but it should be and then. And Copernicus was the scientist that proved in the mid-1500s that the sun was not circling the earth, but it was the other way around. And still the patient is circling the professional in 2021. What would happen if we could add also the ability for the professional to circle the patient in the end of the day? That's what I like to call a modern renaissance, to be honest. Also, of course, with the guidance of the healthcare professional, but this is what we intended to mean when we talked about shared decision-making, isn't it? And now, let's be honest, patients don't have a choice. You have to take a day off, you burn fossil fuels, go to that hospital, find that last parking spot at the rear end of it, you rush to the front desk, you have a 10 a.m. appointment, 2 minutes prior to 10, you're exhausted at the front desk, and somebody would say, he's running late, please take a seat. Remember, that's what's happening. And then again, just to give you one metric in that, in the Netherlands alone, for first-time outpatient visits, so a referral from a GP to the hospital, we have 8.8 million visits. That's as much as 91 million kilometers each and every year that we burn. Just assume that everybody would take a fossil-burnt car for that. So there's also a climate challenge for that. So the social business case also for the patient is totally different and much more negative than the one for healthcare in this example. Like lost working time, the carbon dioxide, of course, and I guess it's not different in other countries. While a large part of healthcare could be done differently. Not everything, but certainly more than we've seen prior to the pandemic. And things are becoming more easy to use, of course. And we often hear that the average patient, if that exists anyway, is not able to use that because those are elderly people. But in my work, I see something totally differently. And apart from the stereotypical image from an elderly couple waiting at a tablecloth to have their meal served, we're now admitting the first Rolling Stones fans to elderly homes. And they are using technology massively. In the Netherlands, the average Dutch citizen owns 1.3 smartphones. That also says something. And we use all that technology that is provided with a simple and logical user interface. And that interface should be developed with or even by the end users, as opposed to us, thinking that we know what's needed for them. It should be designed in such a way that we also see in the rest of society where these metrics are being used for. So I also think that also here we're losing society a bit. In my innovation work in the past 20 years, I often thought that the user interface was broken. need to be repaired, need to be fixed. But I was greatly inspired by Amanda Gorman, the poet that wrote the poem for the inauguration of Joe Biden as the next US president. And she said, the nation is not broken, it's simply unfinished. And I think the same is true for the user interface of healthcare. The world is changing so fast that we almost cannot keep up with it, but we need to up our game. So we don't need to fix it. We also have to make sure that we don't lose society. And we have to look at what's used in society already, like digital humans that are increasingly being used for all kinds of other branches, for instance. Or the use of the mobile phone, where all kinds of data already sit in that mobile phone. We know that the path we're on is not sustainable. Not from a money perspective, and also my colleagues in healthcare, the burnout rates are staggering. And this was the case already prior to the pandemic, even so the shortage of skilled personnel. In the Netherlands alone, 75,000 nurses shortage prior to the pandemic, now 150,000. So from all that I shared with you, you might think I'm a pessimist. I've been named a serial optimist many times, to be honest. And I like to see the future like this. If that picture says something to you, it says something about your day and age, but as well as mine. So the reason why I'm optimist is this. I see technology bringing healthcare opportunities to each and every square inch on this world, for instance, where it will be possible to connect billions of people more to not only bring knowledge to them, but also knowledge from them to the other parts of the world. I'm also optimistic because I now see that the debate about the ethical aspects and the privacy aspects in healthcare are on the radar on every government and every table that need for that. I'm also optimistic because I see that governments are taking up the challenge to go from healthcare to health, because what's not occurring, we don't have to solve in the end of the day. And I'm also optimistic that companies and corporates like Roche, now I need to go back. Does that work? Yeah. Like Roche also have embarked on creating a digital strategy that also is taking digital more up to, in the end of the day, their digital therapeutics. And I see discourses about whether or not we should bring patients always to hospitals like the 91 million that I talked about. So let's talk about the business case for climate in healthcare. And I also am optimistic because I see new players stepping into this world. I'm a patient myself. Every now and then I got kidney stones almost every 2 years. And if I look to healthcare from a patient perspective, I think it's almost 80% blunt logistics. Has nothing to do with medicine. It's purely logistics. And that's where other companies really are stepping into. Let's be honest. Uber was not invented by the taxi branch, nor was Booking.com invented by the travel agencies. Change always comes from the edge. So hopefully, I think that in the end of the day, we will go into a new era where digital first and physical next will be the mantra. Also to make sure that we can take it in a sustainable effort. And it's time to create these kind of things and start with asking. Asking around in everything that you can do as a person, in your own role, in your private life, and make sure that you listen and act in the end of the day. What has been done up until now is not enough to create a sustainable healthcare system. We really have to take a chance and also a different approach for this. What we've seen now during this pandemic is how healthcare would have looked like in 10, 15 years from now if we wouldn't have done anything. So let's take that opportunity. Ask around, step into it yourself. And I also like to close with the story of the president, JFK, went to JFK space station and he asked the janitor over there what he was doing. And he said, I'm helping to put a man on the moon. With that, thank you very much. Melinda, back to you.
Thank you very much, Lucien. Let's give him a round of applause. And Lucien, please stay here with us if you would, because you are going to join our panel and we're going to get underway with that in just a moment. Well, as we just heard there from Lucien, the crisis revealed major deficiencies in our healthcare systems. Digital deficiencies is what he focused on, but of course it revealed others as well. And in some cases, we also saw stakeholders moving to ameliorate those deficiencies. So a central question now is, can we build on that going forward? Can we sustain the gain and widen it. And we want to talk about the digital piece, but we also want to talk about another aspect that we saw transform during the pandemic, namely the ability of people who previously had worked in silos to break out of those silos and collaborate with one another in new ways. Again, we want to talk about whether we can sustain that going forward and build on it, or whether we will revert to pre-pandemic patterns. And we've got a very impressive group of panelists with us to talk about these topics. But before I introduce them, dear ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to ask you to weigh in once again on an audience question. And by the way, I'm just seeing that we did get our YouTube results here. So just to repeat, 41% of our YouTube viewers who were polled did have a family member or friend who was seriously ill or died. 33% experienced economic hardship personally or in their families. 14% had COVID, and 10% faced interruption of treatment. So somewhat more in that latter category, as well as economic hardship. Thank you so much to our online audience for sharing that with us. Now, as I said, we have another poll for you, dear ladies and gentlemen, and it is this. And in this case, please just type in a term or a word, and then we'll take a look at that a little bit later on after I introduce our speakers. The question is, what is the biggest gap in healthcare systems that was exposed by the pandemic? What for you was the biggest gap? Write in whatever is the first thing that comes to mind. And as I say, we'll look at the result in just a moment. I'd like to now introduce our speakers. I'll ask all of them to please join me on stage, and then we'll take it from there. That music was composed for Roche's 125th birthday, and we can see how young this company is at heart. It's a pleasure to now introduce our panelists, beginning here with the proverbial man who scarcely needs an introduction. He's Dr. Séverine Schwan. He's our host. He's the CEO of the Roche Group and has been with the company for 28 years. Not quite 125 years, Séverine, but certainly close. Enough time to have guided some pretty far-reaching transformation. So we're looking forward to hearing about that. And I'm very, very pleased to welcome Dame Kate Bingham. She is managing partner at the British biotech venture capital firm SV Health Investors. She also headed up the UK's high-speed COVID-19 vaccine task force in 2020, steering procurement, development, and working together with those in deployment. And she has served on the boards of numerous cutting-edge biotech firms in the US and UK. Great that you could join us here live in person.
Thank you.
Bingham. Next to her is seated Jan Geisler. He is founder and CEO of Patvocates, which is a think tank and consultancy on patient engagement in research. He was formerly a startup co-founder and manager in the media and telecoms sector, and then co-founded several leading patient advocacy networks after receiving the diagnosis of a rare cancer, namely chronic myeloid leukemia at the age of 28. And I believe that was 20 years ago. Yes. Welcome. Great to have you with us. And finally, it is a great pleasure to welcome Christiane Wopen. She is professor and holds the Heinrich Hertz Chair at Bonn University, and she also is overseeing the establishment there of a new Center for Life Ethics. She was formerly director of the Cologne Center for Ethics, Rights, Economics, and Social Sciences of Health, and she chaired the European Group on Ethics in Science and New Technologies, which advises the European Commission. Great to have you with us. Thank you so much for being here. Let me begin, if I may. One moment. We have our audience results now. And on Polev, we have quite a lot of inputs. That's the audience here in the room. Some of you have weighed in saying that the main gaps you see are access, inequality, supply issues, and digitalization. Thank you very much. And we'll have some YouTube results for you in just a few moments. But let me first go to Severine Schwan. And we just heard digitalization has moved into high gear in health, but of course in many other sectors as well due to the pandemic. What is the main impact for Roche as a global player, both in diagnostics and in pharmaceuticals? And Lucien also reminded us the Renaissance was about human beings. So I would ask you, digitalization, but also in the end, how does it affect patients?
Yeah, I certainly believe there are tremendous opportunity with healthcare finally being more digitalized. I mean, this sector has been lagging behind other sectors, as Lucien has pointed out. If I think of media, if I think of the banking sector, if I think of retail, I mean, in a way, we are still in the Stone Age, where a lot is happening in an analog way, and where a lot of data are really lost because they can never be analyzed. And I think the pandemic and this crisis has reminded us of that. I personally think that could give it a real boost so that we accelerate on that front, and the opportunities are fantastic. If we can harness the insights from big data across many patients, that will help us to understand diseases better, that will help us to better intervene in disease pathways. We can develop better medicines, better diagnostic tests. We can provide better clinical decision support. I think it's a huge opportunity for patients, and we as a company, we certainly want to be at the very front of that move.
Do you have one or two concrete examples of digitalization at Roche and how you see a transformative impact from that?
Yeah, look, for example, at cancer diagnostics and cancer treatment, right? This is an area where we are very active in, and what we know is that treatments and also the diagnosis for cancer can actually, there's huge variations even within one country, right? And if you look into this, a lot of it actually has to do with the diagnosis. So, for example, if you have a solid tumor, right, then typically today you would take a sample of the tumor and you would look at this tumor through the microscope, and the pathologist would make a diagnosis, right? And depending on that diagnosis, you would go for a specific treatment. And what we have seen in the clinical practice is actually there are huge variations, right? So different doctors come to different results. The reality is some doctors get it right and some doctors get it wrong, right? Or pathologists get it right and other pathologists get it wrong. And as a result of it, patients are not treated in the best way, right? So what we are doing is we are investing into new digital tools, machine learning, for example, artificial intelligence. And it turns out that if you train a computer to look at these slides, right, and the diagnosis over time, they get much better than any pathologist or doctor. You typically still would have a pathologist who looks of whether there is something unusual, and you would always have the doctor have a final look at it. But the reality is the quality of the diagnosis goes up, and as a result of it, right, the treatment and the outcome for patients is improved. So we are investing into such tools, and we are also opening up our platforms so that other companies, startup companies, established companies can invest into such tools as well, but benefit from our global footprint so that they can actually reach the patients with those tools. So that's a very simple
great example. Thank you very much, and a very, very interesting example. And by the way, we also have now our YouTube results on that question about the biggest deficiencies, and amongst them, access, trust, supply chain, unreadiness and sustainability. A couple of points also that Lucien made, but in regard to access, certainly the kind of the last point you made about working together with startups to get those innovations to as many people as possible, absolutely.
And also with this example, just to add on that, because access is so important, now there are many parts in the world where you don't even have a pathologist, where you don't have the know-how. Now, if you put this on a digital platform, right, then you can connect centers around the world, also in less developed countries, and bring these latest technologies to those countries, which would have been impossible without the digital tools.
Thank you very much. Let me go over to Kate and ask you to talk, if you wish, about that digital piece as well, because I know that did play a major role in the amazingly successful rollout in the UK of vaccines. But beyond technology, where else did the task force break new ground in a transformative way?
Thank you. So on the digitalization, one of the slowest parts of getting vaccines to show whether or not they're safe and effective is the actual act of recruiting volunteers into trials. And so what we did, and for those of you who are not in the UK, we have a national health system called the NHS, which is the closest thing to a religion we have in the UK. And so what we did is to launch a national citizens registry on the NHS website that would enable anybody to basically sign up and consent to be contacted about clinical trials. And of course, we wanted to enrich in those people who are most at risk of infection, so the elderly and those with underlying diseases, and also certain ethnic minorities. And we now have over 500,000 people, of which 35% are over the age of 60. So it was a hugely successful program, and it allowed us to actually enroll very quickly all over the country, specifically in those cohorts that we wanted included in trials. So that's how we work with digital and also pharmacovigilance. So again, being able to track what are the background incidence rates of safety events and compare that to what we're seeing in the trials. But where we broke new ground in the vaccine task force, I'd say the first thing is we used experts and judgment and did not follow a traditional procurement approach. So normally governments will want to line up all the different options, get all the information, and then say, okay, well, based on this scoring, I want to go for vaccine number 3. And we didn't have that luxury because every day people were dying. So we had to use experts to make decisions on incomplete data. And that was something that worked pretty well. And that then led to the whole concept of risk. Now, spending money up front with the expectation that you would lose either some or all of it, again, was something that governments are not very used to doing. We spent £900 million, so in euros, whatever that is, north of €1 billion, on scale-up of the vaccines, not knowing if any of them would work, including, we took an 18-month fill-finish contract so that we didn't know what we were going to put in it, but we wanted the ability to receive vaccines in bulk if that was one of the shortcomings. And also to fund the clinical trials. And again, we started enrolling phase 3 trials before we knew whether or not these vaccines could actually elicit an immune response. So we knew they were safe. Phase 1 safety testing continued as normal, but after that, we then compressed. So those were quite radical things for a government to deal with.
And interesting because essentially you took a venture capital approach to risk on this rather than that risk-averse approach that we tend to know from governments is what I'm hearing from you.
Well, if you put a venture capitalist in charge, that's how I see things.
Exactly.
You see it in a venture capital way.
Thank you so much. Jan Geisler, let me ask you to pick up a little bit on the point about patient involvement. And in fact, the massive clinical trials that were conducted during the pandemic for both vaccines and also for repurposed antivirals did accelerate digital participation, decentralized communication with potential participants in the trials, as we just heard, and also remote data collection. So obviously that was good for manufacturers, that was good for the task forces that were rolling out the vaccines. Was it also good for patients?
Well, I think you're raising an important point because we always need to think where the value for patients is. And we're a very provider-driven healthcare system where we think about Why do we invent things? Probably because they benefit the system as such. While we always need to think when we think about digital, how can patients actually benefit from that? How can they actually be part of let's say, empowered healthcare decision making? And I think we saw on one hand the high speed that the pandemic has brought. We were fast forwarding things. And with that came things that we have been asking for years: teleconsultation, not going to the clinic just for blood draw, queuing up for 2 hours, sitting there like Lucien was having in his video, queuing up, and in the end you get 10 minutes with your clinician, and probably then you go home again. And now suddenly, which was always told we can't do that, suddenly we could do it. We could actually do adaptive designs, we could do remote monitoring, we could do teleconsultations, we could actually go to the GP and draw blood and send it to the lab, things that have been refused for 10 years when we were discussing about trial protocols. So I think there's a good thing. And I think we need to make use of that, and we're going to talk about that later on. But the question is always, how do we maintain, let's say, that it empowers the patients? Because what we can also see is that we introduce these things to make trials more efficient. Like you were saying, does it benefit the manufacturer? Yes, it does. But what we hear from the patient community, that they say, what do I get from that? Do I then lose the 10 minutes I have with my clinician because I can't go to the clinic anymore? And when we did a survey at the beginning of the pandemic of the 23 cancer patient umbrella organizations, we say great chances and great opportunities, but there are no new vulnerable groups. Those that cannot afford to buy a tablet, those that cannot use the technology. And it's not a question is that we go on the least common denominator and just not making use of these things. We just need to think, how do we serve these populations? How do we make sure everybody has access to digital technology? And then empower them to be part of that, to take the good of it and not losing contact with their doctor. So I think there's a lot of merit in that. But always think about provider value, about patient value, not provider value. And don't think about patients are just there to feed a machine. They need to get something out of that for themselves, and that's their motivation.
And in that way, our Renaissance analogy actually is very fitting, because it did put humans at the center. Let me just ask you to briefly share a point of view on one other issue, because when we talk about these data sets that are so important for the groundbreaking developments that we're seeing in medicine, of course, we're talking about private data, often anonymized, of course, but nonetheless, where do you see the balance between protecting privacy and promoting data-driven innovation?
Well, I think that's a tight line between those things. And that's where I can probably see the difference between a citizen and a patient. Because I think a patient who's gone through a transformational experience like I did when I got cancer, and most of the people we work with, they change their attitude towards data, because they want their data to be used for research. They want to avoid misuse, so they don't want my insurance company to know that I have cancer, so I cannot get life insurance anymore. But they want researchers to do their thing and find things that will probably make life better for future patients and for themselves. And that's kind of the divide that we see in data protection at the moment. I think you don't need to convince the patient community about that. You need to convince the general population, and you probably need to think about or convince the data protection officers that they're still trying to defend our grounds, but without involving us on that. And I think that's a bit of the tight line that we need to find on data protection. I think the good thing is, with the general data protection regulation, we're at least getting a more or less a harmonized framework in Europe, which puts patients at the center to being owners of their data. And now we need to find models in which we can actually use the data properly. And I think that's a huge role for the patient organizations, because they can be the honest brokers and the trusted parties to actually help on data sharing and intended use for data.
And of course, trust is one of the gaps that many people in the audience saw in answer to our question. Let me go to the ethicist on our panel, Christiane, and ask you to talk a bit about that. Innovators in Silicon Valley love to quote that famous motto, move fast and break things. But are we at risk of breaking important ethical and societal norms here, both in the area of data, but also in the area of access? Because, of course, as we just heard, many people don't have access to some digital technologies. I think Lucien might disagree with that, but maybe we can get the two of you to argue that out. Christiane, please.
Thank you very much. Actually, I am more in favor of evolution and taking people with us than breaking things through companies. And of course, it's wonderful to have innovation, and we need data for innovation. And actually, I think that it is an ethical obligation and responsibility to take the data from everyday practice, to do research with them, and to bring the research findings again immediately into healthcare. So have a circular model, we call it the learning healthcare system. We spend in Germany every day 1 billion euro from solidaric spent money. Yeah, and I think we should make something out of it. But as the German Data Ethics Commission already recommended, you have to build trust for those who give their data, because a lot of people are prepared to do that, but they want to trust that they don't experience disadvantages afterwards. So as Data Ethics Commission, we recommended to have prohibitions of use, let's say by your life insurance or by the workplace or so that you can trust that your data stay in the healthcare system. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to equality, I want to take a short step out of the healthcare system and shed a light on what this pandemic showed us about social inequality. And we talk about wonderful digital tools here, and I'm really in favor of them. But we have to be aware that the pandemic has worsened social inequalities and health inequalities in a really disastrous way. The pandemic internationally now led to 811 million people who suffer from chronic hunger. So the UN Sustainable Development Goal to end hunger in 2030 has gone far away. We have 70 million people plus through the pandemic who live in extreme poverty, so from less than $2 per day. We have a vaccine distribution that is really shaming. We have countries with up to 85% of vaccine or fully vaccinated people, and in the global south we have around 3%, in Uganda less than 1%. And I think this is really a shame for the global community after 1.5 years. And there's another problem still, because if you have these wonderful vaccines, and this is a great success story, you have to take people with you to take them. Because if you have them and no one takes them, you also don't end the pandemic. So there are so many other issues to be thought about, that there's really a complex discussion being in front of us.
And I absolutely want to come back to that last point a little bit later when we talk about building trust in science and in scientific findings. But let me now take us to a second aspect that some of you have touched upon. I'd like to drill a bit deeper, and that is on collaboration between heretofore separate and sometimes even antagonistic actors, because certainly that aspect of collaboration is going to be key going forward. So let me ask Lucien, first of all, and maybe you also want to weigh in, by the way, on what you just heard from Christiane, but beyond that, you have called many times in the past for a holistic, joined-up approach to health that brings into play what you call a far wider ecosystem. So I wonder if you can tell us whether you have seen signs of that happening during the last 22 months, and if you think we can sustain it going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I always like to express is that taking a look at the broader society, and then from a health perspective, all of a sudden the supermarket shows up. Why not collaborate with supermarkets to bring more and better healthy food in their supermarkets? Everybody would agree with that that would be a very interesting model, not so much for the supermarkets yet. However, now we all of a sudden see that supermarkets try to chime in on also a market piece on that in terms of creating better health. Talk about the finance sector. In the Netherlands, we've seen that people with a high financial debt are prone to use more healthcare, between 7 and 10%. So what a couple of banks, together with healthcare insurance company, did, they took over that debt, spread it longer, and the higher interest rate was being paid for by the healthcare insurance company. So my point here is that if we would like to look broader in society and the things that we are looking for, we can collaborate better and have also more impact on the everyday life of people. Because we all know that many things that we do on a daily basis are not beneficial for our health. And yet, the only thing that we do now is create a healthcare system that fixes things once they're present. And it's a tough choice to change behavior, as we all know, but also in terms of the inequality, if I may put 1 or 2 points on that. Our family was the first one to own a color TV back in the 60s, and the whole neighborhood came to watch. We had the money for that. I had internet access very early. I had, back in those days, the money for that. And I also bought that very expensive iPhone back in those days because I had the money for that. Nowadays, these things have become a commodity. So my point here is that even though it creates inequality at the first stage with innovation, we pay for that innovation at the first end, and then things get cheaper and get more broadly spread into society. So I think that innovate not for everyone at the first instance, but for a smaller, let's say, happy few, also does work.
When you talked just now about the supermarket, I must say I thought here about sustainability as one of the issues, because in fact the system you described, that we wait for people to get ill before the health system comes in and that we don't do enough on prevention, is in a way all about sustainability.
And we're now putting machines in supermarkets in the Netherlands where you can take your blood pressure, your weight, saturation in supermarkets, connected to the hospitals in the region itself. So you don't have to go to the GP's office or to the hospital anymore, only for those routine measurements, for instance.
Nonetheless, to be a devil's advocate, if I may, you said that even elderly people in the Netherlands are going digital. That may be true in our industrialized economies, but what about the developing and emerging world that Christiane was just describing? There, the fact is many people don't have access to the kind of innovations you're talking about.
Yes, but I had the opportunity to talk to the friends of Severin in South Africa, of Roche, a couple of weeks ago, and they showed me how much the mobile phone is integrated in almost every step in their daily life. To pay for things, to order things, to make sure that they get their signals for HIV shots and everything that goes with it. So I think we could learn a ton of how that is being used over there as well. Second to that, my own mother-in-law is 92 years of age. She recently had a hip replacement and we gave her an iPad. So if you need cat videos, I'm your man, but she's connected to everyone in the family. But the thing is that we did not have to explain how that thing worked for her. So I think the combination of that is also, with the technology being available on a global level, like the internet access that is going to take the world in a fly in 5 years from now, every square inch in the world has that ability, I think.
Thank you very much. Severin, let me ask you to talk a little bit about collaboration and ways of flexible, agile working that you have seen developing now at Roche, whether among your scientists and healthcare providers or between the private and public sectors. Where have you seen changes in that way?
I mean, it's been really, really impressive. I mean, the level of collaboration we have seen within the industry and also with stakeholders outside of the industry, I've never seen something of that kind before. I mean, it's incredible. So, you know, just to give you 2 examples, we are working together with a competitor of ours now to share production capacities, to make sure that the medicines are available around the world. And all these agreements were completed in no time, right? It was clear that we will sort it out. We started to work already on getting everything in place, and kind of the contracts were following, and it was done in a record time. You would never, ever have seen that in kind of normal times. And I think there are lots of learnings of how we can collaborate in the future. Another example is how we work together with regulators, right? I mean, normally if you develop a medicine, then you do your trials, you collect the results, then you do the data analysis within the company, then you prepare your file, then you submit the file, then the authorities come back to you, ask you questions, then you answer the questions, then they come back with new questions, you give them the answers. And by the time you hopefully get an approval for the medicine, typically 2 or 3 years can pass by, right? Now, what happened during the pandemic is for COVID medicines, for vaccines, for COVID tests, for example, that was a rolling submission of data. So when we got new data, new insights out from the clinical trials, it was directly shared with the regulators. So the industry and the regulator was at the same information level. And when the last data came in, the thing was wrapped up and the regulator said, let's go, right? I mean, what normally would take years took weeks or in specific cases even days, because the regulator was at the same level. And I mean, it's incredible. If you would have asked me before the pandemic of whether this is possible, I would have given you 10 reasons why this is not possible, and genuine reasons why I thought this was impossible. And I'm absolutely sure if you would ask the regulators, they would have said, I mean, forget it, it's impossible. Now what we know is that it is possible. And the big question I have now is how much can we bring this over into a post-pandemic world? Because if this is true for a devastating disease like COVID, right, why should that not be possible for life-threatening diseases like cancer or other diseases? I mean, if it worked for COVID, it should actually work for other diseases as well. So I'm hopeful that actually we will literally enter a new era of how the industry and regulators can work together.
And let's get Kate to weigh in on exactly that point. Does it take a sense of emergency like the one we saw to get regulators to finally begin to bend their processes and rules?
Yeah, but also industry, to be fair.
Okay.
Both sides,
So what we saw in the UK, and our regulators called the MHRA, and of course we at the end of last year left Europe. So the MHRA had a double whammy. They had to redefine themselves because of now being out of Europe and outside the European Medicines Agency, but also then the pandemic. So this whole concept of a rolling review was phenomenally successful. And I call it sort of you hand in your essay plan, and then as you've written different parts of your homework, you then talk to them about it. So, I mean, the answer was it was hugely successful, and specifically in our case, with the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, they did not run those clinical trials in the UK because their assessment correctly was last summer our viral load was low. And yet the MHRA was still the first regulator to actually approve the vaccine because of this rolling review. So I don't think it does take a pandemic to do that. I think it takes a very courageous regulator to say, actually, we're not going to be an arm's length advisor. We're going to be a partner of the companies that are developing new medicines, therapeutics, diagnostics. And I think that is here to stay. And I would be hugely optimistic that this is a positive outcome of this pandemic.
Thank you very much. Let me jump over to Christiane and ask you if you like to say a word about regulatory reform or this kind of regulatory adaptation we're hearing about. Do you think we lose crucial safeguards in that process? And then after you've said that, I have a second question I'd like to...
I don't think that we necessarily lose ethical oversight or ethical aspects if we choose an ethics by design approach from the beginning, not developing some technologies and then saying, well, here it is, do you see an ethical problem? But including in an interdisciplinary approach, ethicists and social scientists and all the humanities and of course the natural sciences from the beginning, sitting at the table and say, let's say how we can design this socio-technical system in a way that it is beneficial for the individual and societies. So in such an ethics by design approach, I think everyone should sit at the same table and work together from the beginning.
Then I'd like to come back to a second aspect of public sector involvement, especially in the case of the pandemic. The public sector, of course, is a regulator, but it is also a communicator, and communication was extremely important during the pandemic. And, you know, Angela Merkel was praised for her early public messaging. She was even given an award in the US, largely on the basis of her communication. Joe Biden, Mario Draghi moved from inclusive appeals to outright threats in their own public communication, and yet a fairly significant share of the population in all three of those countries, less so in Italy, but certainly in Germany and the US, remains quite skeptical and mistrustful. So how can leaders do a better job of building trust?
Yeah, that's actually a statement we gave from the European Group on Ethics, together with a group of chief science advisors for the European Commission, how to give science advice and how to work together with scientists in a broad understanding, including humanities and so on, and policymakers. And we had some criteria, have an interdisciplinary work from the beginning. Be transparent, what you know, what you don't know, and what you never will know. So the unknowns. Be target group specific. So you cannot have the same communication to everyone in the population, due to the to language, due to culture, and so on. And be open and honest. And be on eye level, and that got lost a little bit at the end. Politicians became more and more, roughly spoken, a little bit authoritarian. So get vaccinated, do this, do that, this is the right way to go. And the next minister president in Germany said, well, I would go differently. So that was not building trust. And so being honest, on eye level, listening to the people, not only talking to them, and being in an interdisciplinary way of exchange is the way forward, I suppose. And as we see in Denmark, and Michael Petersen did wonderful work on that, trust is one of the decisive factors to alleviate the vaccination acceptance. Yeah, those people who trust their policymakers take the vaccine much easier than those who distrust them.
Right. This, of course, for me as originally an American citizen, that is the central lesson in the low vaccination quotas that we see in many parts of the United States, where polarization is so strong. Polarization is all about mistrust. If I could go to Jan, I'd like to get you to weigh in on this as well, because, of course, as a strong advocate of patient engagement, what do you think is an innovative approach to building trust? Because that's clearly a crucial part of this.
Yeah, I think that the crisis has actually demonstrated how difficult it is if science is not being seen as being part of society. Then you suddenly have a crisis like this and people don't understand why science is for them and not just something happening somewhere in the ivory tower. And I think in the crisis, all the things on Facebook and Twitter went viral very quickly about all those rumors, while we were very slow to respond to explain science and take people with us. What Christiane has also said, actually we need to explain to people, not talk to them and just convince them that they should get vaccinated and otherwise they can't enter the restaurant anymore. It's really explaining why this happens, why you need to be part of the society and why science actually explains how you do that. I think that's very important. Who's got these kind of explanatory roles? And we need to think about the role of patient organizations, I think, in that respect. So how can we transport to the general population what science does, what research does, what innovation does, and why it's for them and not just about them? And I think that's a thing we need to solve, and we still need to work on. We can take a lot of learnings from the pandemic.
So in a way, messaging that's community-based is what you're telling us.
I think so, yeah, and having a translator in between, you know, to really translate what does science say about it and how does it, let's say, how relevant is it for the general population? I think we failed in the beginning of the pandemic to really explain what we knew and what we didn't know, and also talk about uncertainty and explaining that to general people. I mean, that's our business as cancer patient advocates all the time, because we know about uncertainty. People need to take decisions in uncertainty all the time, because we don't know, we can't predict the outcomes. We can just talk about probabilities. But that's not the way we talk to patients. We need to break it down.
Let me ask, please.
May I add one point? Because at the beginning, it was all about virologists and epidemiologists. We found out that it was transmitted, this virus, via the air and aerosols. And then, if you had a look at a map, in Cologne, for example, where I come from, there were parts of the city where you had an incidence of 0, literally 0, and some kilometers further, it was 700. Yeah? So that's not, transmission is not only about aerosols, but there are so many other issues involved, and that's why this interdisciplinary scientific approach is so important.
Thank you. Lucien, do you also want to weigh in on this question of trust and communication? I know it's something you've talked about in the past.
Well, answering that same question from a digital perspective, I think that governments, scientists, institutions also lost sight here a bit. We did not turn to the channels where many of our citizens were. I do agree with Jan about the patient, but there is also a lot of people who are not yet a patient. So if you're not at the same place where the citizens have that debate and the discussions, that's also why many governments during the pandemic turned to social media, even to hire influencers. And one of the big faces in the Netherlands from the whole COVID approach, which is one of the intensivists, at one point joined Instagram and had millions of followers in the blink of an eye, and had a channel to explain from a scientific approach to people on Instagram what he really was saying, and also was able to discuss with that. And then they started to have LifeTalks as well on Instagram and on Facebook. So I also think use the channels where the ones that you want to influence are already present.
Thank you.
And I was just going to add to that. So in the UK, we also use patient advocates. So especially in those communities who are more resistant to the idea of vaccines, we actually use those, often the patients who had actually recovered by being in one of the main recovery trial, which was what was run in the UK. We use them to basically then talk to their communities and their community leaders as to why they should then participate in both vaccine trials and also get vaccinated. So there was a lot of translations and films and social media and explicitly messaging not from politicians, but from people that were trusted in those different community groups.
Thank you very much. I would like to now do one more poll with our audience members. So please get ready with your smartphones if you're here in the room. And our YouTube participants have it easier because the poll is going to appear to them. Our question is, going forward, what one thing should be prioritized to tackle problems in healthcare? And our multiple choice answers are greater collaboration between the private and public sector. We talked about that. More and faster innovation is number 2. More equal provision of healthcare, number 3. More use of telemedicine in healthcare. So unfortunately, you have to make one choice. I know the tempting thing is all of the above, but we don't have that for you as an answer. So please tell us your one main priority, and we're going to come back to that in just a moment. And ladies and gentlemen, let me also just remind you that we want to hear your questions shortly. We're going to be coming to your own questions very shortly, but I do want to do just one last round with our panelists before we do that. So Lucien, in his talk, reminded all of us that we saw transformative changes occurring over the last couple of years, but the big question, and this is something Severine said as well, is can we build on that going forward? Can we really keep this going, or will we revert to old patterns? And at the same time, at the moment, and a number of you pointed this out in the last poll that we did, we are also seeing developments now internationally, and I'm talking about the supply chain disruptions, among others, that raise questions about our preparedness going forward. So my question to all of our panel now in this closing round is, what are your top 3 points for ensuring both preparedness and resilience as we move slowly, hopefully, beyond the pandemic. And I'm just going to go straight across the panel, and then we'll take a look at the audience result from that poll. Severine?
Yeah, I would say on a very fundamental level, it needs the collaboration across the different stakeholders. So, for example, if we in industry want to build digital tools, like the one I referred to, where we develop machine learning algorithms on these samples. Now, as a prerequisite for that, we need the samples, right? So we need trust between patients, companies to share those samples, to make sure how the data are used, etc. We need regulators who look at those algorithms and say, well, they are reliable, they are not reliable. Many other stakeholders, ethics committees, etc. So fundamentally, I think it's a matter of building trust among these different groups. And I'd say, because we talked so much about digital, there's just one element I would add on top of it, and you might be surprised that I say that, but I think in certain areas we also need regulation. I mean, if you look at clinical trials, right? I mean, actually, we get all the data. It's a well-established process. There's a high trust level, but part of that is because it's highly regulated, right? We had a long time to learn about that, for decades, if not 100 years, how to run clinical trials and what regulatory environment it takes. But it's very highly regulated, right? And you know, there's a lot of criticism about the pharma industry, about prices and this and that. But I think there was never, ever, I'm not aware of that, there was criticism of misuse of patient data in clinical trials. Never, ever. And that has a lot to do with the regulation, right? As we now take digital outside of clinical trials into the clinical practice, right, I think we need more regulation. And part of the trust issue we have at the moment is because there are the tech companies who come from the consumer world. They use data for completely different purposes, namely for marketing purposes, right? For personalized advertising. And that has not been regulated. And we have seen going it into wrong directions. And frankly, I tell you, I get so upset when I have these kind of tools and I get these messages and I have to opt out all the time. And if I don't have time, you know, I just give up and I accept, and I have this awkward feeling, what is happening with this data, right? Now, if we would turn this round, right, if it was an opt-in, we would resolve that. Now, of course, it would be a big issue for the business model of the tech companies. But that's exactly what is happening already in other industries, like the pharma industry. And I'd say trust, you know, has a lot to do of how we communicate with each other and how we, you know, but it also needs a frame. And I think in the digital world, we are, you know, the frame is starting to adjust. You're seeing all the efforts in the tech industry now in Europe, and I think these are good improvements, but we are not yet there, right? So I just say it's not only about kind of being nice to each other, talking a lot, communicating. At some point, somebody has to call the shots and has to say, this is unacceptable. Let's agree on rules. And for us, this would make life much easier if such rules were there, and it would actually help us.
Well, here we have in both of our polls, both Polev and so the room and also YouTube, both saying a significant part of the audience sees greater collaboration between the private and public sector as one of the key priorities going forward. And of course, collaboration also can be working together to establish the right regulatory framework. So thanks very much for that. By the way, 47% of the YouTube audience and 40% of the audience here in the room say more equal provision is top priority. So a lot of congruence this time around between both. Let me now go to the rest of the panel with the request for super brief answers. Your top 3 priorities for preparedness and resilience going forward. Kate?
So I agree with the room and YouTube. So more equal provision of healthcare is important. I think as far as vaccines are concerned, we have to just get away from, you know, 2-dose cold chain, unstable vaccines. You're simply not going to get vaccines to northern Nigeria, the Congo, various places if it's as complicated as that. So we need new formats, pills, patches, sprays, whatever we can have which are thermostable and you can get to people so it's much more routine that doesn't have the same cost of delivery of the healthcare. Second thing is we've got to have manufacturing in low population countries, because then you're going to get away from that tension between the governments wanting to keep the vaccine to vaccinate their own citizens and to actually promote export so that you can actually get those vaccines to everybody who needs it, so you can get away from this haves and the have-nots, which have been so destructive, I think, in this pandemic. And then my final optimistic side is billions has been invested in mRNA vaccines, and there's a huge shift now that we can start using these next generation medicines, whether it's CRISPR, gene editing, RNA medicines, where you can start using some of the things that have been developed through the RNA vaccine. So whether it's delivery, targeting, and stability, those are the things that will help develop personalized therapeutics in the future.
Thank you. Jan?
Well, I think coming back to how do we sustain the gain is, I mean, three things. I think we need to keep on the pressure that we've built during the pandemic, because now we have changed things. We have actually used digital technologies. We have actually done remote monitoring and telemonitoring and remote cancer counseling and so on. Let's not lose that momentum and apply it everywhere, and not just where it was necessary due to the pandemic. And there's some resistance in snapping back to where we were, and we shouldn't go there. So we need to keep up the pressure. And so my first wish is actually on how do we build trust for this, and trust between all parties, but specifically also in the patient community, that this is actually for their benefit. And I think a lot of that has to be a new approach to data. So how do we deal with data that's coming out of digital, out of trials, and that we leave these ivory towers where we say data is mine, I've done that trial, so it's mine. I don't share it with competitors and anyone. Second one is really collaboration, which is really, we've seen in the pandemic, it doesn't end at country borders. So I think there's a lot of momentum in the EU at the moment about data and about building frameworks for the battle against cancer and so on. And I think we need to transport what we learned from the pandemic into collaboration models across countries. And then I would like to pick up what Christiane said. I mean, she said ethics by design, patient engagement by design. Think from the beginning what the patients want, what their preferences are, and put that into the design of studies, of services, or whatever, because that will generate services people want. And then I think we're going to have a lot of momentum beyond the pandemic on that.
Thank you so much. Christiane?
I can follow up that. Do it from the beginning, but think the things through to the end, because we're not thinking through to the end. And there are three issues that would be important for me. First, educate scientists and policymakers in communication, and also talking with each other in terms then to build trust. Second, have regulation, governance, and powerful institutions under international law. I know a lot of people will think she's stupid, but if we don't dream, we cannot go further. Yeah, so I think this is a really important step. And third, implement a health in all policies approach, because the socioeconomic determinants of health, and the pandemic has shown this, is much more powerful than all the healthcare taken together.
Yeah, thank you. Lucien is nodding enthusiastically. Very briefly, if you would, Lucien, your top three.
I would say we have to take the lessons learned and mold them into the curriculum of medical students and nursing students and scientists. I think it's an obligation for all of us to share those lessons. Otherwise, in 15 years from now, new ones will come up and they've never experienced what we've experienced. Second of all, I think that this is going in the Netherlands right now, there will be a law that gives people the right on hybrid healthcare. So you as a patient will have the right to choose whether or not, based on medical regulations, to access that part of healthcare digitally or physically. And I think the third is as well, this collaboration between the public sector and private. So I come from a business family. I've learned early on, if somebody's talking about me at a table and I'm not sitting at that table, I'm on the menu. Now big tech is talking about health and healthcare. So you have two choices. Either you join them, or afterwards say, well, that's a bad idea.
Right. Thank you very much. Let us now go to audience questions, and I hope that we have some coming in. Can I get our technical team to switch over to questions? Okay, very good. If you can keep a few more coming, because this one that I'm seeing there, we kind of have addressed it, but Jan, I'll just ask you to very briefly, perhaps you want to add something to your earlier thoughts. How do we get society to trust science?
I think we need to talk more about science and try to put it into lay terms, what it does and how it does it and how it delivers results. And I think the pandemic is a perfect example because we have a success story here. We're talking a lot about problems, but we can talk a lot about success of science and also the deficiencies that we're trying to solve. Be very honest about it. And I think the patient organizations are good placed for that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And I have a question from YouTube, from Amar Feroz to Lucien. Insightful points now that we've broken out of the passive trend with the technologies and users being able to, being accepted. Regulators and regulations are still unclear and slow. What are your thoughts on this?
Oh, I think that we really have to embark on this and also show the examples. I think it's show and tell and also walk the talk. I think that not only big institutions, corporates, but also government needs to show that, like Jan also says, there's also a success story behind this. Let's make sure that we do that as well, also on the technological side.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And while we're waiting for some more questions to come in, let me ask Severine to also weigh in on the trust in science point, because of course this is something that pharmaceutical companies face every day, trying to figure out how they communicate about what they're doing in ways that can build trust.
Yeah, I think you can only trust something if you really understand it. And the problem with scientific matters they are typically very complex, right? So it's a matter of breaking down a complex matter into the appropriate language for whomever you speak with or interact with. And I think we as an industry have a responsibility to kind of translate it in a better way, right? And not overwhelm with too much detail, with too much complexity. I think that's very important, that we always kind of, simplify things and make it easy to understand, which is a challenge because it's complex matters.
There's another question that's come in for you, and certainly I think all of us have had some experience with what this questioner is asking about. COVID-19 has led to populations becoming much more engaged in their own health, at-home testing, discussing health-related outcomes. How will Roche build on that foundation of patient engagement and empowerment, and how does it fit into your ambitions?
I think Lucien mentioned that in his speech as well. Eventually, of course, it's really much more efficient if you can bring things to the patient rather than the patient has to go to a hospital, for example. And we are currently, for example, very engaged in diabetes, and our company has been literally bringing the lab to the patient. Many years back. People with diabetes, they had to go to the hospital to take their measurement, right? And today, they can do their monitoring at home, right? And COVID has shown us the power now with home tests. And certainly, that's a direction we want to embark on as well. And I think it will then just get more convenient for patients to take care of their own health.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I also have a question here for Kate. Is it ethical for a country where 85% of the population is vaccinated to promote booster shots? Or should that country focus on getting supply to other regions? Really critical question at the moment.
I mean, it's very clear that a national solution doesn't solve a global pandemic. So in my mind, the UK and all other countries should be donating vaccines, as they've pledged to do, but so it's all been talk and not very many trousers at the moment, to actually get vaccines to the rest of the world. So I think it is an ethical issue, yes.
And here we have a question. Unfortunately, it's hard for me to read these because I'm only getting partial questions on the screen, but who wants to answer this question? Asks someone here in this room. Corporations seek profit in a similar way as politicians seek votes. The spoils are predominantly monetary, competed over by members of society. The planet doesn't care about this, it only pays for it. What can we do to champion sustainability? Seems to me that question probably goes to you, Severin.
Yeah, I'd say the following. We can only be successful in the long term if the system overall remains sustainable, right? If we are not an integrated part of a functioning system, right, eventually this will fire back to whoever is acting in this system. So I do believe it's also in the very interest of the industry and for us as a company to make sure that a system is sustainable. To the more specific question in terms of profits, now here I really want to say that you also need to be financially sustainable to invest into innovation, right? I believe the capitalistic system, right, where you have startup companies, where you have entrepreneurs who put down their money, take a risk, drive innovation, has actually improved healthcare delivery or has contributed to a better healthcare delivery over the last decades enormously. And I think without the private sector and without investors who put their money to work and who would take a risk to go for such innovations, I think our healthcare systems would look very different. And therefore, I also believe that part of acting in a sustainable way is to keep an environment where it is also financially sustainable for the private sector. Because if there is no reward for innovation anymore in a healthcare system, then there will be no private sector. And I think that will slow down innovation. Eventually, that will be at the expense of patients.
But I do think there's also an issue, because if you look at the COVID vaccine response, most of the major pharma companies worked at non-profit basis. So there was a very clear, and if you take AstraZeneca, they stepped in to work with an academic organisation. They've now got their vaccine in 180 countries around the world, and they're doing it at non-profit, and they're not even a vaccine company. So I think there's been some massive good corporate behaviour in this whole pandemic.
Wow.
Christiane, you wanted to weigh in?
Yeah, I think there are huge differences, actually. So both is true. And I think we have to think about economy in a new way, nevertheless. I think we have to invest in thoughts about going to a common good economy and a holistic ecological thinking, because we don't take serious in balancing our economies what nature all does for us. Yeah? Mm-hmm. And we have only measures and yardsticks that don't really capture what is going on here. And as long as we have these measures, and as long as we don't include what we do to nature and what we use from nature to have our profit, our disaster in the end, then we will not be successful anymore. So I agree to this, but I just want to add a little critical comment and invite to think in a new way.
Well, you're also addressing that issue of the link between biodiversity and disease.
Yeah,
and of course, that is a very, very crucial nexus that I think we're becoming more and more aware of. We're really just about out of time. I've got two questions that have come in that I would like to ask Lucien to address in the most amazingly short time ever. One, and they're big questions. One is about interoperability, and the other one is the one that we see right now to Lucien. Could you, in a far future, imagine a system that digitally replaces a doctor as a whole, and especially for poorer countries, could it bring first-class diagnostics in remote areas? And then there was also one about interoperability. Maybe you want to blend them together.
Well, digital healthcare will never replace the doctor. First of all, we need many, many doctors. We're facing a doubling in healthcare demand. No way can cope with that. Digital technology can augment the doctor or the nurse. And I think that's the way that we're heading for. That's the subtitle of my book, Augmented Healthcare. Mm-hmm. It's all about helping and assisting to treat more people. That's also the same with the tech companies. I don't think that they step into this highly regulated interventions. It's more like the lower complexity things where we should ask ourselves the question, should we do this and can we cope with that with the shortages that we have? Second of all, I think the interoperability, and I think Jan has something to say on that as well, this should be handled on a European level. It's now still every country does its own fair share in it. Meanwhile, tech companies create the standards. It was never the intent by Microsoft to create the de facto standard in statistics with their Excel files. Yet it has become that. And we now see that companies like Apple and others are creating personal health records by the masses in a global scale right now. I have more data sitting on my iPhone than in my medical records in the hospitals. So very soon I will grant healthcare professionals a subscription to my data as opposed to them giving me the opportunity to look in their very small portal about one particular spot of my disease, for instance. But maybe Jan is...
One sentence, Jan. One
sentence.
Sorry,
One
I
sentence.
know.
I do agree.
Well, I think it's important to support the best decisions possible, and I don't think we're going to replace the doctor. We're trying to empower everyone to take the right decision for the individual. That's why we talk about decision support systems, not about decision systems that will take away individual preferences and just find the solution for every patient. Because the judgment is very different from patient to patient and what is important to them. But systems can support that, and that's what we're building, everyone.
And I think the crucial word that I'm hearing there, but that has really been the thread that went through all of your remarks that you've shared with us, is systemic. That we need to really come to approaches that see the system as a whole and all of the linkages, whether it's between digital aspects or different stakeholders or thinking ethics from the beginning to the end, again and again. It seems to me that all of you are calling upon us to take a different perspective that will really bring this very complex system into some kind of balance. So thank you very much for that. That we will have to leave it there. Dear audience, you have sent us so many excellent questions. Thank you very, very much. And if we didn't get to them all, I assure you that we will read and digest them and pass them on to those who have been here sharing their insights on our panel. Before I close our panel, I just want to go to Severine for the quickest of wrap-ups.
I'm very optimistic. I'm really very optimistic. If you see how healthcare has evolved over the last decades, if you compare how different healthcare is today for our children and what our grandparents still experienced, I mean, it's like day and night. And I'm sure that this will continue into the future. I mean, based on the scientific progress. You mentioned all these new technologies, gene therapies, gene editing, many, many more. If you look at the opportunities from all the new digital technologies, I have no doubt that the next generations will enjoy a very, very different standard of healthcare, which will be more digital, which will be more accessible to many more people around the world. And which will be, going more into the direction of prevention rather than curing at a very late stage. I'm optimistic about it, and I hope that we as an organization are part of that.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much for making it possible for us to celebrate the 125th birthday here in this forum with this excellent, excellent panel. Let's give them a very warm round of applause. What a fascinating and multifaceted discussion we have had. So I will ask you to please take your seats again, dear panelists, because we are going to continue straight away. And dear audience, you also are going to have the opportunity to weigh in once again, because now we are going to take a deeper dive into Roche's Fishbowl, and we are going to hear a little bit more about some of these new agile and highly productive forms of collaboration that Roche has been putting into practice. So in the last part of this Life Talk, we want to get to know a few members of the Roche team who are putting their very considerable talents and creativity to work in the fight against COVID in particular, and in cutting-edge innovation in other fields as well. And I'm going to introduce them now briefly and then let them take over with TED Talk style pitches about what the pandemic has changed for them in the way that they're working. And after that, ladies and gentlemen, we also will plunge into that fishbowl more deeply, and our 4 experts will be at your service to answer your questions about their work and their fields. So it is now my pleasure to introduce Cindy Peretti. She is head of the Roche Diagnostics Molecular Lab with a focus on PCR systems, sequencing systems, and testing. She's a former senior vice president in global oncology product strategy for Roche Pharma. She also served as CEO of Foundation Medicine, which supports treatment decisions based on comprehensive genomic profiling of cancer patients. And it's a pleasure to welcome John Young. He's an award-winning research scientist who oversees infectious disease programs in 3 major areas: chronic hepatitis B virus infection, respiratory viruses, and novel antibiotics. And prior to joining Roche 7 years ago, he conducted research as professor at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies in La Jolla, California. Welcome to you. Palani Kumaresan is the global head of research and development at Roche Diagnostic Solutions, covering biomarkers, analytics, software, and instrumentation across all disease areas and technologies. Great to have you with us. And Pierre Simon is global head of manufacturing at Roche Pharma, overseeing an internal manufacturing network of 11 sites in 6 different countries. So now we move straight on into your pitches, dear panel. And ladies and gentlemen, while you listen, please think a little bit more about what you want to hear from Cindy, John, Palani, and Pierre, and get ready to pose your questions during our fishbowl. So dear team, you now have 1.5 to 2 minutes to tell your stories, and we will begin with Cindy.
Thank you. You know, next year it's predicted that we're going to see an alarming 25% increase in cancer diagnosis. So what does this have to do with the COVID pandemic? Due to COVID, people stayed away from routine screening and hospital visits. They just simply did not get tested or diagnosed. The oncology community were worried. No diagnoses, no early intervention or therapy, really a less chance of being cured or living longer. We realized that if people were not going to come into the clinic, we needed to go to them. But we couldn't perform surgical biopsies in their home. We intensified our efforts to ensure regulatory approvals of something that we'd been working on for years, that if passed could be a game changer, not just blood-based biopsies. People doubled down on making liquid biopsies a validated test. In the US, we began home visits. Blood through mobile phlebotomists was drawn. We even began drive-through blood draws at clinics where people didn't even have to get out of their car. With 2 FDA approvals of liquid biopsies in 2020, no longer were these just lab-developed tests. Our approach was now validated. The use of tissue had been the gold standard in cancer testing before the pandemic. But we as a community realized quickly that liquid biopsies could be just as impactful and much simpler. So going forward, liquid biopsy will be used to monitor cancer patients' response to therapies. It'll be used to determine if cancer patients are cancer-free, even to detect if they have cancer earlier than it had in the past. The pandemic exacerbated the problem. The outcome was the speeding up of a new and better solution that enabled validation of thoughtful and time-sensitive life-saving innovations. Imagine this, a simple, non-invasive approach leading to more cures. How many other areas at Roche could benefit from these new ways of doing things? The outcome, simple, faster and smarter healthcare solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Cindy Peretti, for that very interesting look at what you've been working on. And in fact, that syncs absolutely with what we heard earlier from Severine about what also digital developments will be able to do in terms of more accurate and easier diagnostics. So let's go now to John Young and hear about your work. John, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Tackling pandemics, it's in our DNA. What did we do? 18 months ago, we turned our sights on COVID-19 and found new and innovative ways of working together to quickly identify the most promising therapies amongst several hundred potential partnering opportunities. William Pao, the head of Roche Pharma Research and Early Development, and I we're excited to be on the leadership team of ACTIVE, an unprecedented public-private partnership between industry, government agencies, private foundations, and academia. This partnership was formed to break traditional silos with the goal of accelerating the development of new therapies and vaccines. So what happened with our existing infectious disease programs during this time? Even as the COVID-19 pandemic raged, we kept the focus on our ongoing programs, including another pandemic caused by superbug infections. The insidious spread of these infections poses another serious threat to humanity and will likely soon claim more human lives than cancer. At Roche, we are tackling this global challenge with novel antibiotics and diagnostic tests. Our goal is to find the right drug for the right bug at the right time. And I'm so proud of the fact that our team advanced our first novel antibiotic into clinical development despite the challenges we faced with COVID-19. Indeed, this program has the potential to be the first new class of antibiotic for the most difficult to treat bacteria in over 50 years. Pandemics have been with us throughout human history, and they will be a part of our future. How do we build on the lessons learned from COVID-19? New types of partnerships, more agile ways of working, and more, so that we, as a global community, are better prepared for the next one.
Thank you so much for that, John Young. Let's go now to Palani Kumarasan, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Melinda. This may seem like a lifetime ago, but let me take you back to Wednesday, March 11, 2020. That was the day the WHO declared COVID-19 a global pandemic. 2 days later, we were on the lawn of the White House talking about our very first FDA emergency use authorized COVID-19 test for broad testing. 20 months, several SARS-CoV-2 variants, multiple solutions, and over 660 million Roche tests later, we are firmly standing up to the enormous challenges brought upon us by this pandemic. So how were we able to rise to the occasion as an organization? This certainly did not happen overnight. I believe it's a combination of two things. Many years of consistent investing in science and technology, building those muscles, and creating the right culture and mindset of collaboration and risk-taking, driven by a deep sense of purpose. So this begs the question, can this warp speed innovation born out of crisis be internalized? By no means I'm advocating that we should be continuing to work 24/7, but I do believe the answer is yes. And for food for thought, I want to point to three areas. Firstly, all companies, big and small, need processes to keep us organized. But how do we stay vigilant about these processes taking over organizations? Secondly, evolution has taught us to react impulsively when we are faced with a crisis, danger, threat, failure. How do we train ourselves to stay creative and curious during these times? And last but not the least, how do we bring that laser focus in the organization that we were able to achieve during the pandemic? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And indeed, picking up on several points we just discussed with our earlier panel. We go now to Pierre Simon, please.
Thank you, Melinda. So I will never forget the first day I joined Roche. It was in April 2020, and it was also the first lockdown day. So just imagine, you are new in a company in charge of a big manufacturing network, and you cannot visit the site and meet your team in the US. So, and to make the situation even more challenging, my boss called me and said, "Hey, Pierre, we must find a way to double the supply of one of our key products, and at the same time launching a new COVID molecule in a record time." So that was really a cool start. But this pandemic has really forced us to find new way of doing things. Firstly, on the digital space, we discussed it. Virtual augmented reality glasses enable me to visit the site. Through advanced analytics, our capacity has increased and we have now instant visibility on our supply chain. The second innovation happened in the transfer of technology field. We perform a technical transfer of a COVID molecule in record time by performing tasks in parallel and no more sequentially. And what really helps us is a strong collaboration with development and regulatory agencies. And the key question is, can we use the same path going forward? Thirdly, the pandemic has increased the supply chain resilience. Our sites stayed open and continue to supply the patients. Unprecedented collaboration has been seen between pharmaceutical companies to keep shortages of material to a minimum. A key question is how the geopolitical aspect will impact our site footprint. We will see more sites in the future in the world. And for sure, the greatest innovation is the adaptability of our people. They reimagine the way they work, really pushing the limits for the benefit of the society. So how can we continue to innovate while being mindful of their health and well-being? That's the key question.
An excellent question indeed. Thank you so much for that. Thanks to all of you. I'd like to move straight into our Fishbowl, where you're going to take questions from the audience. And let me just remind everybody that, again, we have quite a compact window of time, so I'd be very grateful to Cindy, John Palani, and Pierre if they would please also keep their responses pretty brief. And I'd like to try, I'm going to take one question now from Polev, from our polling tool, and then I would like to also try to take some questions from the room. Let me just ask our technical team, do we have a microphone that are, yes, we do. Great. Okay. So first of all, the question to Palani. Congratulations on serving the world with testing. How can we leverage that laser focus going forward?
Absolutely. I mean, and for an organization like us, that's the one thing that we always have to continuously be challenging ourselves. What are the different areas that we really want to say yes to? And what are the areas that we don't want to say yes to right now? Because there's so much to be done and so much value to be added that's the constant struggle. And this is where leaders, all of us have an important role to play to bring that focus from every level of the organization and also challenge ourselves and challenge folks around ourselves is where we are going to say no, because we are going to come to it later.
Prioritizing. Thank you very much for that. Now, who in the room would like to pose a live question? We do have mics, so if you would like to pose a question, please just give me a sign. And yeah, please.
Hi, everybody. Sylvia Becker here.
Will you tell us who you are? Exactly.
Sylvia Becker from Switzerland. I just had a quick question for Sydney. Just wondering, where do you see the biggest potential for blood-based biopsies in the future?
Thanks, Sylvia. I would highlight 3 areas. The first is what we were just talking about, which is the diagnosis of cancer. About 70% of cancers today are shedding. So the big cancers, lung cancer, breast, prostate, those are all shedding cancers. And so you can use those in the diagnosis of cancer. The second place is in monitoring treatment. So understanding if the patient is responding to the therapy. Blood-based biopsies can be used for that. And so you can stop therapy for a patient who's not responding and continue therapy for a patient who is very quickly after that patient's dosed. And then the third is in cancer screening, where we now have the ability even earlier to detect cancer through blood.
Thank you very much for that. Who else has a question they would like to pose in the room? Don't be shy. We're eager to hear from you. No one at all? Okay, then I'm going to take one online. To Pierre, what are the plans with manufacturing to address the 3 to 5 times more medicines to patients at half the cost to society? I think to bring 3 to 5 times more medicines to patients at half the cost.
So I would say the first one is the digitalization will help us to increase drastically the productivity and to reduce the cost of the medicines. A key challenge will be, can we build additional sites in other countries, okay, because there is a trend on regionalization. So what we see today is that we have a trend of building more inventories than building new sites for 2 main reasons, because we have long lead time to build sites and we have a limited regional demand. So, but it's clear that making the difference for the patient is first focused on increasing the productivity and the quality on the manufacturing side.
Thank you very much. I have a question here as well for John. I could imagine that COVID has shown us how to speed up and work together to foster innovation. How can AMR use this approach?
I think actually what I have seen is that there's a crosstalk, if you like, between the way that AMR, antimicrobial resistance, or the superbug infections is being pursued, and also the way that COVID-19 was pursued. And I'll give you one example. There's a public-private partnership that's been formed around antimicrobial resistance, the AMR Action Fund, it's called. It's really industry coming together with the Wellcome Trust, with the European Investment Bank, WHO, other stakeholders, to really tackle what is one of the key challenges in antimicrobial resistance. And I'm seeing similar developments now happening with pandemic preparedness. You know, for example, there's a new organization called the Intrepid Alliance that has a very ambitious goal of developing, 25 new antivirals so that the world will be better prepared for the next pandemics. And I think that there's a lot of learnings and cross-fertilization I see between both sides of these different pandemics.
Thank you very much. I have a YouTube question from Saman Feroze for Palani. Does Roche believe in digital biomarkers for early signs of dementia?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I'm happy to comment, and others can chime in here too. Absolutely. The simple answer is yes. And we have, of course, looked at this very carefully in some of the different neurodegenerative diseases like dementia, because one of the things that we are really lacking is the ability to diagnose definitively some of these neurological disorders, debilitating disorders early enough. Even though we don't have curative therapies right now, but being able to diagnose them early enough can really help address the progression of the disease. And here, digital biomarkers absolutely have a role to play. We also think other biomarkers that can be very simply tested, similar to what Cindy was talking about in oncology. Here also, if we can have a blood-based biomarker as well, along with other digital tools to have an early diagnosis of, say, Alzheimer's, that would be hugely beneficial for the society.
Thank you. Let me go to Cindy with a question also from our YouTube audience. Shruti Bilore poses this question. Incredible work at making the diagnostics for cancer patients more accessible. Is Roche committed for home health care beyond cancer and diabetes?
Yeah, and I would encourage Palani to join me on this. This is something that we are talking quite a bit about in diagnostics and looking at how we can do more home sampling, home testing, and in fact have a number of efforts kicked off looking at that. COVID has shown the world it can be done, and we want to think about where else we can make that application available to customers and patients.
Thank you. Palani, would you like to weigh in on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll second what Cindy said. I mean, and one of the things we have seen is from this pandemic, people have gotten much more used to doing self-sampling, whether it's you're taking your own nasal swab, you're taking your own capillary blood, or any other kind of self-sampling. And here we clearly see that we have to make it easier for folks to self-sample and be able to share their samples easily with the healthcare providers to do the testing and so on. Just think about it. In the morning, if you want to do a simple fasting test, right now you have to wake up, you have to stay hungry, you have to go to a phlebotomist and get your blood drawn. And some of us can get cranky by the time we can eat then. But here, if you had a device where you could do a self-sampling and you send it off, and then you can have your coffee or so on, that can be hugely beneficial, simple things, and people are asking for that. And we are really trying to address this from our side.
Thank you very much. Very interesting indeed. Palani, I actually have another question that just came in for you from the audience. How do you apply the learnings from the pandemic to other diagnostic innovations you have in the pipeline?
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. And this is where the three food for thought that I shared. I mean, one of the things that Severin was also talking about earlier is with the regulators, with other collaborators, we were able to work really in tandem during the pandemic. And we were able to do that within our own organization amongst different departments and functions. And we think that's something that we can take forward instead of doing many of the things serially. How do we take those calculated risks and collaborate very much in tandem, both internally and externally? And the other part that I mentioned earlier, which is very important, is the pandemic brought a clear focus. We all knew what we needed to do. No one had a doubt about what they need to be working on. And that's the kind of laser focus and prioritization that we can also strive for in regular times.
Thanks so much. I have a question for Pierre. What are you most excited about when it comes to manufacturing of biologicals in the future?
So it's really to make the difference for the patient and to cure and treat new disease. That's what excites me, and that's what makes my sense of purpose and what I'm doing. But what's ahead of us is just amazing in terms of technologies, the evolution. We move freely toward more small quantities, specialties, and it's opened up to really new solution and disruptive solution on the technical area also to treat the patient.
Thank you very much. And here's one for Cindy coming in from YouTube. How have oncologists reacted to the blood test biopsy? How did Roche manage the behavioral change for doctors accepting the change in diagnostics?
Thanks for that question. I think that, as we continue to develop more and more data with liquid biopsy, I think there's a comfort level that is gained with the oncology community. There's been a lot of data put out to date in those main tumor types that I talked about. What we're seeing is faster uptake in North America, as an example. Europe is slightly behind that, and then we're seeing in a number of other markets that it's going to take a little bit more education to get people comfortable with using liquid biopsy.
Thank you very much. And let me just try one more time in the room. Maybe some in the room now would like to pose a question. Raise your hand if you would. Okay, not seeing anything there yet. Good. Then to the diagnostics colleagues coming again from our online audience, how does Roche plan to help manage increased data acquisition from at-home diagnostic tests? Who would like to take that one? I see Palani nodding.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sure. I mean, absolutely. I mean, this is, at the end of the day, I think this also comes to some of the points that were talked about in the panel, the interconnectivity, the interoperability, the standards that are being created. And here we have to also think very carefully about, okay, what are the devices that are close to patients, where many of this information will be captured at home. I don't think people will want to carry multiple different devices at home. They will carry the ones that they use the most. And we have to find ways of how we integrate into those devices to make sure it's seamless for patients to enter their information there, and it's seamless for us to also capture and use that information. And there are different standards that are coming up. We previously heard, whether we like it or not, there will some standards that will take root, and we need to make sure that we are working with those standards. And these are things that we, of course, explore. I mean, diabetes care, the patient management there is clearly one of the areas that you get close to patients, but there are other areas as well where people need constant coagulation monitoring and so on and so forth, where we clearly see this taking shape.
Thank you very much for that. And let me see if we have, how do you ensure sustainability, economic, environmental, and social, is considered holistically in decision-taking at all levels? That's a really big one. Who would like to take that?
I'm happy to start. I think one of the things that we talk about as we're making decisions on the types of programs that we're going to invest in and develop is we use criteria just like the ones you talked about, which is what is the impact it's going to have, not just for Roche, but on society, on the patient as an example, and really look at, is this something we want to invest in? We partner closely with Palani's group to look at how do we make this a sustainable investment, and there has been an amazing amount of work done around that as I think about our diagnostic testing today and really looking at how we can make our tests more sustainable to society.
And can I maybe go to John as well on that? Because, of course, you were talking in your own work about superbugs and so on. As we know, those are going to have a profound impact, especially in many emerging and developing countries. So perhaps you also want to talk a little bit about the social and economic piece in that. We talked a lot earlier about equity and access.
Yes, I think that clearly antibiotics is one of those areas that's really challenging. It's challenging from a technical standpoint in being able to discover and develop new types of antibiotics to deal with today's drug-resistant bugs. But there are additional challenges as well. The commercial market for antibiotics is a very challenging market, for example. And so really what's required here really is a holistic approach. That involves not only discovering and developing new antibiotics, but then really having a sustainable ecosystem with which these antibiotics can be brought forward for the benefit of patients. And this really requires comprehensive partnerships in areas such as market reform, better stewardship practices, better access practices, to make sure that the antibiotics that are being developed are getting to the right patients. Because I think as we've learned from many infectious diseases, and COVID-19 is no exception, infectious diseases don't respect any borders. They'll cross borders at will. Yeah. And it's very important that the medications that are developed get to the right place, to the right patient population to deal with these infections as they emerge.
Essentially the same point we heard earlier from Kate, that a national approach simply is not going to be effective. Let me go once again to you, John, with this question, also coming in from the audience. In what directions do you see Roche expanding as a result of the pandemic? Will Roche, for example, invest in production of a vaccine?
That's a great question. Something we've thought about, obviously, especially over the last 18 months. Traditionally, we're not a vaccine company, and we took a very conscious decision early on in the pandemic to really focus on our strengths. And our core strength is in the area of therapeutics, and that's where we've made the biggest difference from the pharma side. But we are keeping a very close eye on the development of vaccines and thinking about, where they might be applied. But there's really, currently it's not part of our core business model. And so the focus for the moment is really on the therapeutics and what we can do there to bring value to patients.
And maybe I'm just going to ask the rest of the panel if anybody else has a thought about where you see Roche expanding in future, because we're just about coming to the end. So the path forward is a good way to perhaps wrap up this fishbowl. Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
I can make a quick comment where we are expanding, and I can maybe stay a bit close to the pandemic and say that there's still a lot more that we need to learn about this virus. One of the key questions that we want to be able to answer is, in the future, who would need booster shots? How do we determine what level of immunity someone has from the different vaccines? And this is something that is an active area that we collaborate with vaccine manufacturers. It's an important question that needs to be addressed. There is immunity that works in different ways. We need to better understand. Typically, it takes years to better understand immunity against different viruses. So there's a lot more work to be done, and these are areas we continue to focus on because the fight continues.
And it strikes me that that clearly must also be an area where big data would be of enormous value to try to understand what those distinctions are. Thank you so much to all of you. You've given us a fascinating look at your work, at lessons learned, and at where you're heading in future. We really, really appreciate your contributions. Thank you so much, Cindy, John, Polamny, and Pierre, for that. And dear ladies and gentlemen, to all of you in the room and also to all of you who've been with us online, thank you so much for your contributions, for your attention, and also for sharing your thoughts and questions with us. That has indeed been very enriching for this debate. This inaugural Life Talk is now at an end. But you can look forward to our second installment on healthcare access, a crucial issue that we've been talking about here repeatedly this evening. That talk will be coming from Singapore in the second half of February. And once again, I would like to also thank all of our speakers, the 4 who've joined us online in the Fishbowl and those who are still with us in the room, for the truly fascinating and very multi-dimensional exchange that we have had here this evening. I'd also like to thank our organizational team and our translators. They're all working hard there behind the scenes to make this discussion possible. I'm very, very grateful to them, and of course to our host, Roche, for celebrating its big birthday with all of us. And I hope very much, ladies and gentlemen, that our paths will cross again in future. And until then, I wish all of you well. Stay healthy, stay safe. Goodbye. Thank you.